By the time the shovel bit into bone, the town had already decided nothing was wrong. It started with a dull, wrong sound under the hard pan behind the last house in Dry Chapel. Not the scrape of metal on rock. Not the grate of shovel on old root. Something softer, hollow, like knuckles rapping a locked door. The man holding the handle paused, boot heel sinking slightly into ground that felt too loose for a yard that had never seen rain. The desert around him lay flat and watchful. Heat pressed down from a white sky that had forgotten how to make clouds. Dust gathered in corners, in the cracks of the boardwalk, in the wrinkles at the corners of old eyes. Wind slithered low along the ground, carrying the smell of dry sage, old smoke, and something else under it. Iron, maybe, or guilt. The lone stranger had ridden in at dawn, long coat gray with trail dust, hat brim cutting his face in half. The bay horse under him moved like it had been on the road for months and had forgotten how to stop. No one knew his name. No one asked. They just watched him from between slatted shutters and warped door frames, the way a man watches whether he doesn't trust. And if you're riding with me this far, partner, go on and tip your hat. Hit that like button, drop a word in the comments, and subscribe for more tales from the West. Then the day pushed on, and Dry Chapel pretended he wasn't there. The stranger stabled his horse at the edge of town, near the dry arroyo that used to be a river. He moved like a man stitched together out of old injuries, shoulders slightly high on one side, knee with a small hitch, back held careful, as if some piece of metal still lived inside it and resented motion, under the dust. His features were cut hard and lean, with sun-carved lines at the corners of his eyes and mouth that made every expression look like an old habit he had tried to quit. He walked the full length of the town once. Saloon mercantile, two-story hotel sagging under its own weight, church with no bell, a sheriff's office that looked too clean for a place this poor. Behind the buildings, a strip of scrub and hard dirt backed into a low bluff, and behind the bluff the desert opened again, wide and empty, as if the town were a mistake the land was waiting to erase. He noticed three things and folded them away. The way men in the saloon stiffened when the word North slipped into talk. The way the sheriff's eyes cut toward the widow's house every time he stepped out on the porch. And the patch of ground behind that house that wore a different color, as if the sun had never quite set on it like the rest. The widow's place was last in the line, back to the arroyo, picket fence leaning like it was tired of standing guard. The yard was bare except for a water trough ringed with white lime stains and a crooked clothesline with nothing hanging. Behind the fence, a rectangle of earth showed a history no one wanted to read. The soil that was darker, looser, the crust on top cracked in a pattern that didn't match the baked plates of ground around it. The stranger's boots carried him there as if the road under them had taken over the decision. He drove the first shovel in afternoon, when he'd hammered the town flat, and most folks were inside pretending not to hear thunder that hadn't yet arrived. Metal slipped through dead topsoil too easily. Below, the earth gave way like something already disturbed, already broken, waiting for the next hand to finish what had been started. Behind him, the town held its breath. The sheriff watched from the corner of a window, fingers drumming on the glass. The owner of the only mine, a man whose face had never learned how to be anything but sure, sat in the saloon, ledger open, eyes on numbers but mind nowhere near them. The widow herself stood in her kitchen, hands braced on the table, staring at nothing, shoulders drawn tight against a future she had tried to keep from arriving. The shovel struck bone again. The stranger wiped sweat and dust from his wrist with the back of his hand, studying the exposed shape in the dirt. Pale curve, not rock, not root. The desert preserved what it took, turning flesh into parchment and bone into dry stone. He scraped gently, efficient, motion spare and practice, like someone who dug more holes than he was proud of. A rib cage surfaced first, collapsed but recognizable. Then an arm bone, length wrong for a child, wrong for a woman. A button glinted in the dirt, brass dull by years. The stranger turned it with his gloved fingers, reading it without needing a stamp. Union Army issue, Western Theater. A soldier's coat had rotted around it once. He dug on. The story in the ground rose piece by piece. More bones. Another skeleton curled awkwardly toward the first, knees drawn up, skull at an angle that spoke of haste more than care. The remnants of leather belts, The faint pattern of wool on the earth. Empty holster. No guns. No sign of markers or prayers. Just a pit and men stuffed into it. Far off, the desert shifted tone. Wind picked up grit and threw it sideways. The empty arroyo whispered, tasting something new coming down from the distant hills. Clouds, thin and high, started to gather in the far blue, edges fraying like they were thinking about turning mean. The stranger straightened slowly, spine complaining, eyes tracking the ground beyond the bones. The rectangle stretched wider than two bodies, longer than three. Soil slumped at the edges, corners marked by the faint ghost of post holes. Someone had built a cover over this once. Boards, maybe a shed or a corral, something to make the ground look busy and boring, until years covered the memory. Now the board were gone, burned or hauled away. Only the scar remained. He stepped back and took in the lay of the land. The widow's house in front. Sheriff's office down the street, door open, breeze sneaking in, handcuffs glinting dim in the shadow. Mine owner's big house up on a slight rise, porch deep, shade thick, curtains drawn. The stranger had come here for a reason. Whispers in border towns about a company strike that had ended with a convenient cave-in. Old veterans in dice halls mentioning a lost patrol that disappeared on its way home. Escorting men ready to testify about theft and murder in a mining district no one liked to name. A letter, years old, folded and refolded until the edges turned to lint, signed with brother's name that never came back from the war. Dry Chapel had been a word on that paper. The pit answered the rest. Rain was the next threat, and it came quick. The clouds above the mesa thickened, darkening from chalk to bruised iron. Thunder rolled across the flats, low and steady, more like a drum than a crack. The first drops hit the dust with the sound of shot corn, scattered and sharp. Then the sky opened, and the town vanished under a sheet of water that hadn't visited this basin in months. The pit drank it. Water filled the hole like it had been waiting, mud loosened around the bones, turning dry outlines into shifting, unstable shapes. The stranger moved fast, cutting drainage channels with his shovel, sending rivulets away from the grave, so the dead didn't float into the yard like accusations. Mud splashed his coat, his boots, his hands. Lightning lit the sky enough to throw the entire scene into hard, cruel clarity. One man alone in a downpour, fighting to keep the earth from spitting out history in front of people who weren't ready to see it. Up the street, townsfolk poured from doorways, pulled as much by rain as by rumor. Faces lifted to sky, mouths open to catch water, like it was salvation. Then eyes tilted toward the widow's yard and narrowed. They saw the man. They saw the hole. They saw the bones. Panic always came as a chorus. Voices rose, tangled with the sound of rain on roofs. Some crossed themselves. Some cursed. Some started toward the pit, shoes slipping in new mud. The sheriff stepped onto the road, hand near the butt of his iron, jaw tight, eyes calculating distance and witness count. The stranger kept digging the runoff. He worked like he was on a clock only he could see. His movements drew a channel from the pit toward the arroyo, carving a path for the water to take. The trench filled quickly, water racing away, taking silt and the first hints of bone dust with it. The pit stopped rising. The bodies stayed where they were. But the evidence had broken the surface. Rain turned streets into brown rivers. The arroyo, dry that morning, woke in a single breath. Water surged along its bed, foaming around buried rocks, dragging branches and trash. The new channel from the pit joined it, thin and dirty, carrying the sins of the yard into the wider current. The stranger watched the flow with a soldier's eye. The arroyo cut behind the sheriff's office, behind the mine owner's house, behind a little lean-to shed where documents were stored in fireproof boxes that could not float. He saw the line of travel as clearly as tracks in fresh snow. Whatever washed out of the pit would head downstream, battering at foundations, undermining roots, carving new marks. Flash floods exposed things men thought were safe. By evening, the storm slowed to a sullen drizzle. The town stood reshaped. The main street wore rivulets and ruts it hadn't carried before. The arroyo ran higher, cutting closer to the rear of the big house on the rise. In the widow's yard, the pit sat half full of clean, rain-fed water, bones dim shapes beneath its surface, like the eyes of something looking up from the past. Word spread faster than the runoff. Old miners whispered that the bones belonged to men who'd spoken against the company, men last seen marching with a Union escort years earlier and later listed in ledgers as lost in action. Church folk muttered that the ground had given them back for a reason. The widow, pale and shaking, kept her a chair and stared at nothing, remembering the night a wagon had creaked behind her fence and men's voices had hushed when they saw her lamp. The sheriff moved through town like a man walking across his own grave. He had been younger then, deputy under a badge that answered more to money than to law. Orders had come from the big house, not from any judge. Men had been marched behind the widow's fence in the dark and never come out. He had helped lift a shovel that night. He had helped build the shed that hid the spot. He had told himself the war muddies lines, and a man follows his pay. The mine owner watched the water against the hill behind his house and felt, for the first time, something like fear that didn't involve silver prices. That night, the stranger did not sleep. He walked the length of the arroyo with a lantern and his shadow for company, measuring where the new channel ate at the bank. Water had undercut a section behind the mine office, revealing the edge of a buried box, iron corners glinting under submerged roots. Another foot of erosion, and the current would take it. He scrambled down, boots sliding, coat heavy with drying rain. Cold water grabbed at his ankles. He dug with his hands this time. Mud sucked at his fingers. Reluctant, the box surged free with a lurch that nearly put him face first into the flood. He dragged it up the bank, muscles burning along old scars, and cracked it open with a rock. Inside lay paper, sealed in oilskin, still dry. Ledgers, signed orders, lists of names, not just for the dead in the pit, but for others, workers transferred after accidents that had no witnesses, shipments skimmed and taxed twice, bribes recorded in a clerk's neat hand. A quiet history of a town built on bones and lies, all stored where water could have erased it in one more storm. The stranger did not carry the box to the sheriff's office. He did not bring it to the mine owner, or to the church, or to the widow's porch. At dawn, he walked into the center of town and set the open box on a crate outside the saloon, where men waited for doors to unlock. Rain-warped planks creaked under his boots. The street glowed with that flat, washed-out color of the world, whereas right before the sun decides whether it's coming back. He stepped away and let curiosity do the rest. Hands reached in, pages lifted, eyes moved, faces changed shape as they read names they knew and numbers they didn't. Old fights clicked into new patterns. Missing men stopped being rumors and became entries with dates. The sheriff's signature showed up often enough to make the blood drain from his cheeks when he pushed through the crowd and saw his own hand on the paper. The mine owner stepped out from his house on the rise to find half the town already looking up at him. There were no speeches, no trials laid out in careful rows. The West did not move that way. Not here, not yet. Justice came in rough shapes. Some men grabbed rifles. Others grabbed rope. Fury scattered itself in too many directions to settle clean. The stranger watched long enough to see the balance of power tilt. Watched as the sheriff's badge came off his chest and hit the mud. Watched as the mine owner stumbled back from the edge of his porch under the weight of eyes that had once flicked away. Watched as the widow stepped from her doorway, shawl tied around her shoulders, and looked toward the pit behind her house with a face drained of pretense. Then he turned and walked away. He did not stay to see whether the town chose hanging or exile or some rough compromise between. He did not wait to hear if the dead behind the fence got real graves or just a fence of their own and a piece of sky. He had done what he came to do. He had dug where everyone said not to, followed the water, and let the land spill its own confession. Out on the flats, the desert accepted him back without comment. Wind dried the last of the storm from his coat. The bay horse found a steady lope, hooves drumming soft over ground that held more secrets than it ever offered. Behind him, Dry Chapel worked through a new story of itself, one with fewer lies buried under the back fence. Somewhere in another town someday, someone would mention the man who came, dug where he shouldn't, and left justice behind like a scar. They would argue his name, his past, his reasons. They would not agree. But under the dirt a single yard, where rainwater now soaked deeper into loosened soil and found the bones of soldiers who never got a roll call, The truth lay easier. The stranger's own story stayed buried, where he preferred it, under old wounds, under too many miles, under choices that never quite came out even. He rode on with that familiar weight inside him, shifted now by a grain, a shade, a fraction, in a land that wrote most of its endings in dust and ledger ink. Sometimes the only justice a man could count on was the kind he dug out himself and left behind without a word.